we're back from our break now, and we were just speculating about our people in Sugarland and Katy. I see someone there. Are you Sugarland or Katy out there? We have someone in the off-campus site. Yeah. Yeah, we're talking to you. He doesn't want to answer. Is he pressing the mic and it doesn't work? Maybe it doesn't work. Okay. We have one blank spot there, so we may have some other people there who are not in touch with us. Okay, sorry you can't ask any questions, but you can always email your questions to me or to Libby and our TA. Okay, now we're going to turn to Normandy across the other side of the channel. We're going to look to see what the Viking development was in Normandy, and next week we're going to merge them both together, but right now we'll look at Normandy. I have a picture here of some Anglo-Saxon architecture, and as I mentioned before, there isn't very much of it that survives, and mostly it's because the Normans tore it all down. And when they conquered England, they built churches and administrative building and castles all over, and houses all over England, and they just tore everything Anglo-Saxon down. And so not very much survives. But here are some remnants that show what Anglo-Saxon architecture is like. It's much simpler, it's less developed than Norman architecture. It has these typical sort of round arches and this kind of stonework that is typically Saxon, and the buildings are quite small. I showed you one church, I think, that was very small. I'll show you another one because the Normans actually built small churches at first too, and in the Viking Age, people were building small buildings. Anyway, but I thought I'd let you look at Anglo-Saxon architecture and see what it looks like. Now we're going to turn to the Normans. And what is different about the Normans? What do you all see here that's different about the Normans right away?
They're on horses?
They're on horses. They're fighting on horseback. And so this is what distinguishes the Normans from the Scandinavians of all kinds, because when the Danes and the Vikings fought, they either didn't bring their horses, or if they rode horses, they dismounted and they fought on foot. Now the Normans retained foot soldiers, because here are the foot soldiers. These would have been maybe the higher, wealthier peasants, or the very lower aristocrats who couldn't afford horses, which were very, very expensive. Only the very rich could have a horse, because a horse was like, you know, a Jaguar or a Rolls Royce to us today, because these horses were so expensive. They had to be specially bred and trained. And when the Normans switched from that Viking mode of fighting to this kind of fighting on horseback, then I think that's one component that we can use to say that they were now Normans. And the question is, when did they do that? And the answer is, we don't know. So a lot of this is really guesswork. Okay, let's look at our map, and we can see we're going across the English Channel here. Here is England that we focused on, the Kingdom of Wessex and Mercia and the Danelaw are all there. Across the Channel, directly across, is Normandy. But Normandy, actually Normandy is the old province of Neustria, but when the Vikings settled there, it wasn't Normandy yet. It was the Normans, the Vikings, who later became Normans, who created Normandy, which was a new creation. It was like Russia. Russia was a new creation, and so was Normandy. And so we'll see how they do it. Here we can see Normandy in the context of France here, and we're going to see Normandy grow quite interestingly. Here we're taking a closer look here. We're getting closer to Normandy, and these are the historical boundaries of the province of Normandy, actually to this day. And now we're going to get real close to it, and here we can see all the place names of Normandy, and we'll come back to this map these two maps from time to time so that we can look at Normandy and the important places in Normandy. Okay. So Viking Normandy. The foundation of Normandy is traditionally called 911, is the time when Normandy was founded, because the King Charles the Simple donated or gave Normandy, granted Normandy to Rolf the Ganger, the Viking. But there was a prelude. In the time before Rolf the Ganger received Normandy from the king, Normandy had been pretty much ravaged by the Vikings. They had been through that whole area and really chewed it up. For example, in 841, Rouen and Jumièges were burnt to the ground. Rouen was the major city of Normandy, which dated all the way back to Roman times, and Jumièges was one of the most important monasteries in Normandy. In 845, the Vikings reached Paris for the first time, and in 851, they wintered over on the Lower Seine, which is the region of Rouen in present-day Normandy. King Charles the Bald built fortified cities and bridges up and down the Seine, trying to keep the Vikings out, and on all the other rivers. But remember that the Vikings weren't organized, and they were pirates, and they were thugs. I mean, they weren't royal armies so that you could deal with them, because little bands of Vikings were penetrating all the rivers of France, and so the King of France just could not deal with them. As early as 876, Rolf the Ganger first appeared in Normandy. And remember that he had been fighting in the Orkneys before he came to Normandy. He was the son of Jarl Ragnvald of Moor and the brother to the Jarls of the Orkneys, Turfiner and Hallard. And so you should refer to your genealogy of the Earls of the Orkneys there. In 877, Charles the Bald died, and he was succeeded by another king, Louis the Stammerer, in the west. Meanwhile, in 882, Charles the Fat ruled the east and the middle kingdom, and he was paying off the Vikings right and left. He was paying Danegeld, large payments to the Vikings, long before the English paid those Vikings. So here come the Normans in their ships, and here is a drawing of a Norman ship taken from the Bayeux Tapestry, which I'll refer to repeatedly. The soldiers I showed you, and maybe I'll go back and pull out those the Normans fighting on horseback. This is from the Bayeux Tapestry, and it's one of the major sources for the Normans and the Norman conquest. And I'll tell you more about it as we go along. I wish I had done some more pictures of it. Well, here is Normandy, and here is Rouen, the city of Rouen, and it's a really interesting place in the river. It's at the place where it's the first ford of the river. You can't ford the river all up here, all that way. This is the first ford of the river, and ocean-going ships can go that far up the river and no farther. It's a classic place for a big trading city to grow. London is at exactly that place on the Thames River, so it's a perfect place for a big, important city to grow. So here is Rouen, which was easy picking for the Vikings sailing down the Seine River, and Jumièges was right on the way. The green spot there is Jumièges, the abbey, which was then devastated. And the Vikings went down all these rivers. Look at all the wonderful rivers that Normandy has. I'm sure the Vikings thought they were wonderful. And they went down all these rivers and just sacked all the monasteries and either killed or drove away most of the people. So one of the things about the Viking invasions of Normandy was it was relatively empty, because they had burned out virtually everybody and driven out everybody from Normandy. And so it was not completely empty, but relatively depopulated, and most of the monasteries had been burned to the ground. So the Vikings were very destructive of Normandy. Here is a picture of the city of Rouen, which is a beautiful city. It was a big city even in the Middle Ages, and so you can see what a splendid city it is right there on the river, which is very wide and navigable. See how small those ships are. perfect for the Vikings. I mean, they would see this as the ideal city for them in the ideal location. So Rouen was a place they really wanted. It was Charles the Bald who paid 28,000 pounds of silver to Godfred, Siegfried, and Orm at Elsu, and who gave Frisia to Godfred. In 884, the West Kingdom was taken over by Charles the Fat, and in 885, Charles the Fat arranged for the murder of Godfred. So that's how he dealt with him. He just wiped him out. In November, however, 885 to November 886, Paris was besieged, and the Vikings came in great force to Paris, and the importance of Paris as the key to France was revealed. At this point, Odo, Count of Paris, defended it heroically, but Charles the Fat sold the Parisians out. He then bought off the Vikings, and so the Parisians deposed him in 888, and they replaced him with Odo, Count of Paris in Paris. And it's from the line of Odo, Count of Paris. He is Odo Capet. His son was Hugh Capet, and the Capetian kings were descended from this family, the Counts of Paris, and they were going to be the family that took over the monarchy of France. Well, Arnulf was king of the East Franks in Germany, and in 891 Arnulf defeated the Vikings in Frisia, and this group fled to Kent. This just illustrates, Rolf and the Vikings in Frisia illustrates how these Vikings were everywhere, back and forth across the channel. They could go anywhere they wanted to. And this is the kingdom that Charles the Bald ruled in the west, and you can see it's breaking up. It's breaking into its local components of the different counties in the west. And although the German kingdom, the East German kingdom, looks like it's unified, it's really not. It's breaking down into its component parts too. And that is the impact on Europe of the Viking invasions. At this point, King Charles the Simple granted Normandy to Rolf, who is also called Rollo or Rue. He can be called Rollo or Rue, and we'll see him called Rue in a little while. A treaty was made at the moment that Charles the Simple granted Normandy. It's called the Treaty of St. Clair sur Epte, and the lands around the Lower Seine were ceded to Rollo. The Lower Seine is at the top of our map, by the way. Let me show you where the Lower Seine is in a moment. Rollo also promised not to invade other Frankish lands. He promised to accept baptism, and he promised to swear fealty or loyalty to the king, the same kind of oath of loyalty that Charlemagne had demanded of his vassals. This area that Rolf actually got is smaller than the ecclesiastical province of Rouen. And at this point, then we can start dealing with the sources for Norman history. And one of the main sources is Dudo of Saint-Quentin. And I have Dudo here. There's a new translation out by Eric Christensen, Dudo of Saint-Quentin's History of the Normans. It used to be thought that this book was a bunch of fairy tales, that there was nothing of any use or value in it because he made up lots of stories about it. Recently, it has been revived. Some historians of the period of this period have looked at it, especially Eleanor Searle, but also several other historians have looked at it and reinterpreted it and said that Dudo wrote what the Normans wanted to believe about themselves. Even though it's not true and he made up lots of stories, what he was doing was making up a mythology. He was making up a history for these Normans. And he wrote at the court of Duke Richard I and Richard II of Normandy, and he told them what they wanted to hear about themselves, and he laid a mythical foundation for the Normans as a great people. And so it is valuable, and it's very interesting to read it, to see what the Normans wanted to know about themselves. So this is a very important source. The next source, the next set of sources, and the most important is the life of Erlouan of Beck. Erlouan was a monk of Beck who founded the Abiah Beck, and the translation of that is in my book, The Abiah Beck and the Anglo-Norman State. This is an older book that has a short introduction, but it's a translation of all the lives of the abbots of Beck. And the most important of these lives is the life of Erlouan. Erlouan founded the monastery of Beck in Normandy, and it's the earliest piece of native writing. Dudo of Saint-Quentin was from outside of Normandy. He was a French scholar who came to the court of Richard II, possibly to educate them, to teach them. But Erlouan was a native and he was a Norman. And the life of Erlouan was written by a Norman as well. Another of the great historians was William of Jumièges. I don't think I brought William of Jumièges with me today, who wrote very early. He wrote right after William the Conqueror conquered England, and he wrote a very important history of the Normans. Another primary source is the life of Anselm, which I think I didn't bring with me. Anselm was also an abbot of Beck, and there was a very important biography written of him by a monk of England, of Canterbury. But this is probably the most important source of all, the Ecclesiastical History of Orderic Vitalis. And you can see here that this is volume 2. There actually are 6 modern volumes of Orderic Vitalis. He was a prolific, prodigious writer. He wrote this enormous history. Everything you ever wanted to know about Normandy is in here, most of it. But he tells these little family stories. It's not a unified history. It's not a history that starts at the beginning and tells a story from beginning to end. It's little bits and pieces and vignettes, and he'll tell a story and that'll remind him of something else, and then he'll tell another story, and then this book is mostly about early Normandy, the period I'm talking about tonight, before 1066. And then in the later volumes, sometimes he'll remember something he left out here and he'll put it in those volumes, so then you have to cross-check all of them to make sure you get everything that he wrote down about it. One of the interesting things he wrote was family history, because he was interested in a particular family, and Orderic Vitalis was a monk of the Abbey of Saint-Evroul. And let me write that down. It's the Abbey of Saint-Evroul in Normandy, which was founded shortly after the Normans got there. And he was very interested in the Grosmesnil family, because they were the family that founded Saint-Evroul. And so they're the Geroys, the Geroy family, and they're also, one branch of them is the Grosmesnil family. And so a lot of his history is about that family. Does that make you think of immediately? Viking sagas. It makes you think of family history. And the truth is, this book, Orderic Vitalis, this set of books, you can track hundreds of families in Normandy, and you can track who was married to whom and what the family alliances were and who was connected to whom and who their children were and who their grandchildren were, and you can track all the families of Normandy through Orderic's writings. William of Jumièges is very similar. William of Jumièges was also a Norman from the Abbey of Jumièges, which was refounded, by the way. That's why it was destroyed by the Vikings. It was refounded, and so then he was a monk of Jumièges. And it's exactly the same way. It stresses the history of families. Family history was extremely important to the Normans, and that's very Viking, isn't it? I mean, our Vikings, all our Viking sagas are like that. So I've given you an idea of most of the sources. There are also charters, and there are documents, legal documents. There are a lot of modern accounts, and I won't dwell too long on the modern accounts. For a long time, the French considered Normandy French, and they only wrote about the French part of Normandy. and they sort of ignored the conquest of England. The English, on the other hand, only paid attention to the Normans who conquered England, and they didn't care where they came from or what they did in Normandy. And so you had that division along national lines for a long time. Then the Americans came along, and one of them, and the Japanese too, are like the Americans in looking at this, and they have bridged that great divide across the English Channel, connecting the Normans in Normandy to the Normans in England, and trying to connect up what the culture was like in Normandy with what it became in England, and then what it remained in Normandy, and how England and Normandy interacted with each other. So that's the new style of history that's being written. In the 19th century, there were all kinds of really wild things that were going on among the historians. Well, here is the area on the lower Seine. The lower Seine means the river flows this way. This is the bottom of the river. And so this is about the area that Rollo got in the beginning. Okay, some of the famous historians who've written, these are Englishmen, E.A. Freeman and John Horace Round. Be careful if you get any of their books, if you're doing your term paper on Normandy or Anglo-Norman England, because Freeman was I hope I don't get them mixed up, a Whig, and John Horace Round was a Tory, and they were at each other's throats. E.A. Freeman thought the Anglo-Saxons were the real, pure, wonderful Englishmen, and they were the ones who really did everything that founded the English tradition. John Horace Round was of the Norman group, who believed that England didn't even start until the Normans conquered it, and so that all of England is derived from the Normans. And so they're so funny to read. They're hilarious because they're very English and very witty, and they stick the dagger in and twist it, and it's really interesting to read about them. The French have their own school of thought and their own quirks. Michel de Beauard thinks that Normandy is the center of the world and that there was nothing ever wrong with Normandy. It was the most brilliant province in all of France. Georges Duby is a social historian, and Lucien Musset has done a lot of social history. I have a problem with Musset. He doesn't footnote anything, which really upsets me, because I can't find, where his sources are unless I already know them, which doesn't help when you're doing research. And Georges Duby is a very famous social historian who integrates Norman history into the history of all of France, but they tend to be very French. Charles Homer Haskins was the American who first bridged the gap between France and England, and David Douglas, R. Allen Brown, David Bates, and David Crouch are modern Englishmen who have done really good work on cross-channel studies, as has Eleanor Searle, an American who did early Normandy. Her book is Predatory Kinship. It's a really remarkable book. The English woman Marjorie Chibnall and the Dutch woman Elizabeth van Hoots are the prominent scholars now. Well, Normandy rose from the Counts of Rouen, which Rolf the Ganger was just a Count of Rouen, and they rose to the Dukes of Normandy. And Rolf started out as a Count, and he sort of promoted himself to Duke. He and his sons later on became called Dukes. They labeled themselves because a Duke is more important than a Count. A Duke is a military leader. He's stronger. He's more important. And so they kind of promoted themselves. In 911, Rolf the Ganger was granted Rouen by King Charles the Simple, and Rolf became Rollo Count of Rouen. In 912, Rollo was baptized and married Charles the Simple's daughter, Gisela. They didn't have any children, and so some people have wondered if the marriage actually took place, because nobody trusts Dudo of Saint-Quentin to tell the truth, and so they're not really sure that marriage ever took place. There surely was a betrothal, though, and there was an intention, but she might have died. Here is a view of Rouen in a lovely watercolor, Rouen from the river, and of course the river would be this big attraction to the Vikings. They loved Rouen, and it was a rich prize for Rolf and his gang to get. And here is Rou, or Rollo. He's being baptized. This comes from Was, the Chronicle of the Roman de Rue. Did he adopt Christianity? Did the Normans adopt Christianity? How soon? Well, there are vast arguments about this, and nobody can agree. David Bates, who is the prime arguer for a really quick conversion, thinks that it took them 100 years to really convert to Christianity, but he thinks they did it very, very quickly. I don't agree with him. I don't think they were even converted by 1066. I mean, I think that they were maybe half converted by 1066. And my evidence is the life of Verlois, which I've studied a great deal. When did they adopt the French language and how soon? I think the evidence is very clear that they adopted the French language in the first generation, because by the second generation, William Longsword had to actually travel from Rouen to another Viking colony in the city of Caen to learn Old Norse, because he only spoke French. And so the evidence, that's pretty fragmentary evidence, but it looks like they learned French very quickly. And they were Vikings, after all. They were very practical. And it made sense to learn the language of the people you lived among and you wanted to trade with and you wanted to enslave, to put it bluntly. But to rule the city of Rouen, you had to know French. And so they would have wanted to do that. What about feudalism? Marjorie Chibnall argues that it didn't even exist at this time. She kind of argues that it doesn't develop until maybe the conquest of England. Other people argue that feudalism existed in the time of Charlemagne. This is a whole can of worms. I sort of don't want to get into it. But the standard view is that the Normans brought feudalism to England. But then we have a fly in the ointment with Richard Abels, whose book on lordship and kingship in Anglo-Saxon England virtually argues that England was already feudal before the Normans got there. And so it's a terrible argument. You're safer just to not even use the word feudalism, which people are starting to do, just not even use that word anymore. Nevertheless, feudalism is an institution very like the kinds of lord-vassal relationships we've seen in England and also among the Vikings. So feudalism is sort of up in the air. One of the things they did was adapt cavalry warfare very quickly. They adapted the lord-vassal relationships, which they brought with them from Scandinavia. They brought that lord-vassal kind of relationship, and they adapted that in France. One of the new things, some of the new things are the cavalry is new. The castles are new, building castles all over Normandy. And a castle means a little fort, a fortress that you build to defend the countryside with, and that's pretty new. The institution of fiefs or land grants granted by a lord, that's not new. They were doing that in Iceland. I mean, they were doing that in Scandinavia, granting lands from a lord to a jarl to his herd or his vassals. That's all over the sagas. So the new things in Normandy are cavalry, mounted warfare, and castles. And Rollo mobilized his men, 924, that's only about a little more than 10 years later. Rollo had acquired the Bessin and Maine. So he had expanded Normandy. He had practically quadrupled its size. And we'll turn to that map real quickly so you can see what he did. Okay, here, I forgot to color this. This is the Bessin, all of this. And this is Maine. And Maine wasn't even part of Normandy. It was just something he conquered. And so he had expanded his boundaries to all of this area of Normandy, this part of Normandy, the Caux, and Rouen, this area. And so he was expanding westward and southward. In 925, however, Rollo handed over power to his son William Longsword, who ruled from 927 to 942. And in 933, only 5 years later, William Longsword acquired the Cotentin and the Avranchamp. Okay, here is the Cotentin up here and the Avranchamp down here. And so now we've got Normandy pretty much in its to its extended boundaries, with the addition of Maine. And later on, they're going to add all of Brittany to it as well. So these guys are out there conquering. They're just like the Vikings who conquered England. Nothing's going to stop them if they can help it. William Longsword acquired the Cotentin and the Avranchamp, and in 940, William Longsword, who was raised as a Christian, and so he must have been raised by a French mother or a French governess, but William Longsword restored the Abbey of Jumièges, and he kind of starts the restoration of Christianity in the province. Hasting, the Viking Hasting, had destroyed it. Jumièges is the first abbey restored in Normandy. In 942, however, William Longsword was assassinated by Arnulf, Count of Flanders. And here we want to turn to our map, because what William Longsword was doing was fighting in Ponthieu up here, trying to conquer that. And because he was assassinated, he failed, and so Ponthieu up here remained independent of Normandy. Normandy stops here. But the Flanders is up there, and so the Counts of Flanders could see these Vikings impinging on their land, and so they went through there. Here is our genealogy, and so we have William Rue or Rollo or Rolf is the founder of Normandy, and William I Longsword is his son. And when William I died, his son Richard I became the next Duke of Normandy. And by the time of Richard I, they're being called dukes because their land is so largely expanded. They're not just Counts of Rouen anymore. Now they're dukes. And so here is Richard I, who married twice. He married Emma, a Norman, that's a Norman name, and Gunnar, who also was a Norman. And here we see the expansion of Normandy, and here are some of the lands in those expanded lands. This is the area around Évreux, which is about in the middle of Normandy. This beautiful, beautiful land. It's just glorious countryside, very rich, wonderful dairy lands. And here are the meadows of Bayeux, which is in the Bessin, which is in the center, again, more to the north and toward the coast. And here is Le Mans, which had a big city in it. This is in the county of Maine, which Rollo conquered very quickly in his career. And so here we have a big church and a big city that they conquered and incorporated into it. Here is another picture of Maine so that you can see the cathedral from the river. Le Mans is on a river, and so of course the Vikings would love that. And here is the area of Coutances, which William Longsword added to the Duchy of Normandy. And here are the meadows with the sheep grazing and this just beautiful countryside that is part of Normandy. William Longsword's son, Richard I, who was at the age of 10 when his father was murdered, succeeded him. And in 966, Richard I restored the Abbey of Mont Saint-Michel. And Mont Saint-Michel is a very interesting abbey because it's right on the border between Normandy and Brittany. Mont Saint-Michel, and here is our map of Normandy. They've got the Cotentin now, and Mont Saint-Michel is right about here. And it's just on the border. And the Normans considered it a Norman monastery. It's on an island. It's very incredible, but it's a very old and ancient monastery that the Vikings did not destroy because it's surrounded by quicksand. And so even the Vikings couldn't cope with that. And so Mont Saint-Michel was protected by its natural environment. But in the beginning, it seemed to have been Breton, part of Brittany, and then the Normans pretty much incorporated it. And by the time of Middle Norman history, there was an abbot who had come from the Norman Abiah Beck was ruling Mont Saint-Michel. Cassandra Potts has a book on Mont Saint-Michel, and she is the one who raised the question on whether it's Norman or Breton, and it's not at all clear which one it belongs to. At some time, Duke Richard I married the Duchess Gunner, and she was a part of a group of Vikings who had settled with a new settlement at the city of Caen. And Caen was not a city when they first settled there. The city of Caen is, let's see if I can see it on this map. The city of Caen is about up in here. You can see it right there. And here is Bayeux just to the north of that. But Caen is in the, it was originally not a city at all, but it was at the confluence of two important rivers and also where two important Roman roads crossed. It was a natural trading post, and so you can see why Vikings settled there. It was a perfect place, and so it was a Viking colony, and everybody settled there, and it became the second major Norman city. And the Duchess Gunner was a new infusion. Richard was the third generation. The Duchess Gunner was brand new, Danish from Denmark. And she then, what she did was create a new aristocracy. She and Richard then, in order to keep the Normans or Vikings from fighting among themselves and killing each other off, what they did was to take all the female relatives of the Duchess Gunner and married the eligible men that they wanted to succeed to power in Normandy to the relatives of the Duchess Gunner. And this created a new aristocracy. Not an aristocracy by birth, but an aristocracy through the female line and through marriage. And so all the Norman aristocracy is descended from the relatives of the Duchess Gunner. And this is a very interesting phenomenon, and this is what Eleanor Searle writes about in her book Predatory Kinship, that this is what the theme of it is the relatives of the Duchess Gunner take over Normandy and they form the aristocracy. At this time, Caen had begun its important growth as a city. It was a nexus of trade with England and France and Spain, and at that crossroad, the confluence of two rivers, and also where two major Roman roads crossed. My graduate student Priscilla Watkins wrote her dissertation on the city of Caen, and she was able to reconstruct the growth of the whole city, and it is just an incredible story of the Normans creating that city from nothing, building canals, building trading networks, building markets, building the town, and building the trade. And the really extraordinary thing is that two Muslims lived there and bought houses in the town. So that's how widespread their trade was. And probably these were Muslims from Spain, but this is clear proof that there was this enormous trade with Spain. Well, Richard I then restored the Abbey of Fécamp, and the Abbey of Fécamp became another very important monastery in Normandy. And here we have our counts of Normandy, Richard I, and then when he died, his son Richard II married first Poppaea, and she was a kind of mistress. It wasn't a real marriage. It wasn't a Christian marriage, and I don't think he was much of a Christian. But he married Judith, who was the daughter of the Count of Brittany, and from that point on, the Normans considered Brittany part of their rule. They considered themselves to rule Brittany, and so we're going to see that. And this is at the very same time that Emma of Normandy, who was a daughter of Richard I and Gunner, Emma of Normandy then married Ethelred, King of England. So we see marriage alliances, and the English are acquiring Brittany through this marriage with Judith, and they're casting greedy eyes on England through this marriage of Emma with Ethelred Unred, King of England, who is about to be defeated by all the Vikings. So you can see how their ambitions know no bounds here. Okay. In 996, Richard II dies and is succeeded by his son Richard II, who ruled from 996 to 1026. And at this time, then we see the Normans going a Viking. That's the only way I can describe it. It looks like the Normans are going to a Viking because they start drifting into southern Italy. And here we can look at our map and we can see here is Normandy right here, and we've got them acquiring Brittany now through marriage, and they've cast greedy eyes on England, and now they're moving down either overland into southern Italy, or they're going by sea across the trade routes, but they're filtering into southern Italy. And we don't know exactly how they traveled and how they got there, but there they are, a whole bunch of Normans stake out the land there. They sort of scope it out. They look to see what's going on. They go to Italy and they see that it's very chaotic in southern Italy. There are lots and lots of little kinglets and lordlets down there. Lots and lots of rulers, no unification. It's a land of opportunity. All they have to do is conquer it. And so they infiltrate it. They come in groups, and then there's even a legend that some of the counts, the Lombard and Byzantine counts of southern Italy, actually call them in to rescue them. And again, that's one of those suspicious myths about the calling of the Normans to come in and save them from their own chaos. But the Normans moved down in there beginning in about the year 1000. They may have gone on pilgrimages to Jerusalem. They may have gone on adventuring raids into Constantinople. We don't know why they went to southern Italy, but once they found out that there was a market for their warlike activities, for their fighting spirit and their fighting skills, they started pouring into southern Italy. And they were hired they started out as brigands, highway robbers on the roads of southern Italy, and then they were hired as mercenaries, and then they started marrying the daughters of the local counts and making marriage alliances. And so they had their foot in the door, and by the time England is conquered in about 1066, they've got all of southern Italy, and by 1091 they conquer Sicily as well. This looks to me like they're going a Viking in southern Italy, and they're infiltrating it, and they're coming in roundabout ways, hiring themselves out, marrying people, and then taking control of the land. Meanwhile, in 1002, at about the same time the Normans first start going to Italy, in 1002, a Cluniac reformer, William of Dijon, arrives in Saint-Wandrille and Jumièges, and he reforms those abbeys, but he doesn't make them Cluniac. He does sort of refound them and reform them, and he brings books and learning and education there, but he doesn't make them Cluniac. In that very same year, Emma of Normandy, who is sister of Richard II, is married to Ethelred Unred of England. And at some time, there's the marriage of Richard II to Judith of Brittany, who is the sister of Godfrey, Count of Brittany. And so from that time on, the Normans pretty much grab Brittany and they claim it's theirs by inheritance. Because the children of Richard II claim Brittany by inheritance. In 1005, we have the birth of Edward the Confessor, who is the son of Emma and Ethelred Unred of England. And meanwhile, more Normans are going a Viking in Spain. In 1018 to the 1020s, for example, Roger of Tony was fighting in Spain, and he comes back and he brings a bunch of loot, and then he goes back to Spain and gets some land, and so we have these Normans sort of going a Viking in Spain. In 1025, Richard II and Judith founded the Abbey of Bernay with her dowry, and so more and more, probably under the influence of Dudo of Saint-Quentin, the Norman dukes are learning to be Christian dukes, but they're not totally Christianized yet in 1025. And here is a picture of Emma of Normandy. And she is getting a letter, receiving a letter here. And here is one of the Norman churches that are being refounded at this time. This is a very early Norman Romanesque church, and this would be something like the interior would be like. This particular one is in Rouen. But in 1026, Richard II died, and his son Richard III inherited. But he died within a year, and so his brother Robert I the Magnificent became Duke of Normandy, and Robert the Magnificent ruled from 1027 to 1035. Sometimes he's called Robert the Devil, but I'm not sure where the origin of that is, but mostly he's called Robert the Magnificent. Meanwhile, we have other Normans going a Viking in Italy. In 1028, Ranulf settled in Aversa, and he settled the earliest Norman settlement in Italy. He eventually became Count of Aversa because he married the daughter of Sergius, Duke of Naples, and so we have now a Norman count in Italy. In 1030, Goscelin of Arc founded the Abbey of La Trinité du Mont, and in Rouen, Norman aristocrats were copying the Duke by founding and reforming monasteries all over Normandy, not because they were religious, but because it was a place to put their excess children, and it was also a way of controlling more land. If you controlled the monastery, you could control more land and more wealth. Therefore, in 1032, Duke Robert the Magnificent, Robert I, founded the Abbey of Cerisy-la-Forêt in the Cotentin. It was also a way to control the newly settled lands, especially in the Cotentin. And here we see our genealogy again, and we can see Richard III, who died within a year. Robert the Magnificent then inherited. He married Arletta over here, and he had a number of children, the most important being William the Bastard, who became William the Conqueror. Arletta was a concubine. But a concubine, the thing is, all of these dukes have concubines. They're called concubines by the Christian monks who are writing all of the chronicles, because they're not Christian marriages. They are married, what is called more danico in the custom of the Danes. They're not Christian marriages, and so that the Christians don't consider these real marriages. They may well have been real marriages, but they're not considered real marriages by the Christians who are writing the history, and so that's what's important here. Okay, here is an ancient church of St. Paul, and this is the kind and the size of churches that these nobles who are copying the Duke, this is the kind of church they would be founding in the countryside. Just tiny little churches like that, but they have magnificent carvings in them. These are some carvings from, this is the art on the walls of the Abbey of St. George de Bosqueville, which is one of these aristocratic abbeys in Normandy, and here is this very Romanesque, very inventive and imaginative art. It looks very Viking here with this axe-wielding guy, and here's some kind of a wolf biting the heads of some people. And here is another warrior-like figure who is pounding on something with a hammer and a club. And this is from the same church. These are two knights who are engaged in war with each other, fighting a joust, and this would have been from this time of Normandy before 1066. Well, in 1031, Duke Robert the Magnificent helped King Henry I of France in a war to gain his throne. And remember that Henry I of France had married Anna of Kiev, who had been the daughter of Yaroslav the Wise. So we're seeing all these connections with all the Vikings. But in 1035, Robert the Magnificent left on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and he died on the way home in Bithynia in July of 1035. He was then succeeded by his son, William II the Bastard, who then ruled from 1035 to 1087, an enormous time. 50 years William the Bastard ruled as Duke of Normandy, because he inherited at the age of 7. What happened was, when his father died and William the Bastard inherited Normandy at age 7, Normandy exploded into civil war. All the barons grabbed whatever land of their neighbors they could. They killed their neighbors. They took what they could. They just really went berserk almost. Yeah, question.
Did he have to go to hiding? Like, didn't his mom send him away for like until he was probably like 14 or 15?
It wasn't his mom, it was his uncle. It was Robert, Archbishop of Rouen, who was the brother of his father, who then protected him and took care of him. And then he had to spirit him out and sneak him out of the house, because so many people were trying to kill William the Bastard as a child, and there were other rivals to the throne. And so he learned at a very young age that he had to be strong, he had to be shrewd, and he had to be better than anybody else. And he started learning this at age 7 from this very tenuous childhood. His uncle, Robert of Jumièges, protected him and spirited him out of dangerous situations. By the time he was 15, that's when he fought the Battle of Valais-Dune, and that was when he emerged as a real leader of men. He won his knighthood, and he was only about age 15 at the time when he led that victorious battle, and that was the first step in reunifying Normandy. But it took him about 7 years. I mean, Normandy really fell to pieces for about 7 years. And it's very clear in Orderic Vitalis. I mean, he describes all of these neighbors attacking each other. And you can track them on a map. You know, if you want to know where all these people lived, some of these maps you can see them, like the map of Normandy I've been showing you. Most of the places are listed on this map of Normandy. But if you really want to track down all of these places where all these families lived, get the Michelin maps of Normandy, and the manor houses are still there in Normandy. You can track down all these families, and their manor houses still exist. All these family names of all these Normans are throughout Normandy, so they're still there. Well, Orderic records vast killing and civil wars between all these people. Here is William the Bastard. I'm showing Duke William seated on a throne. You know, he's always shown seated on a throne, which is interesting. It's almost a foreshadowing of the fact that he's going to be king someday. This is again the Bayeux Tapestry, which is a work of great propaganda for the Normans. But here he's showing Harold, Duke Harold, who is swearing an oath of fealty and homage to William the Bastard before Harold became King of England. This is when Edward the Confessor was king. Yeah.
When Harold went, and I guess he was serving as missionary to King Edward, and promised him like the throne of England if Edward passed. Is that when, like, supposedly Harold promised?
Yes.
Is that it?
Yes, that's when Harold promised that he would recognize William the Bastard as the heir, the legitimate heir to Edward the Confessor, who was the son of Emma and Ethelred. Edward inherited the throne of England and was King of England after Canute died, and and he didn't have any children, and so everything was wide open as to who would be the heir of England. And he had promised it to William the Conqueror in 1051, and William held him to that, and that's why he made Harold swear homage and fealty to him. But it's possible that this is a piece of Norman propaganda. It could be a lie. I mean, it's possible that Harold never swore this oath, and that the Normans are just saying that he did. They created this myth in order to justify their conquest of England. And I think that's entirely possible. The thing is, we will never know. We will just never know what the truth is, because there's a Norman side of the story and there's an English side of the story, and they contradict each other, and we don't know which one is true, and we can't cross-check them because they're just two different stories, and they can't both be true. So, people choose up sides. Well, here are the Normans fighting on horseback, and here are some Normans. This is the old Hugh of Gournay gets together all his men to go to war, and so a Norman going to war. And here are the kinds of castles that they build. Only the Normans are building wooden castles. The stone castles don't come until after England is conquered. All the castles are built of stone, of wood, and they're just little rickety things that are sort of thrown together. They're usually built on an artificial mound. If there's no mountain or no hill that they can build a castle on, they make one. They dig up the dirt and they make a mound to build the castle on, because it's hard to gallop horses uphill, and it makes the castle more defensible. This is the castle at Rouen. It's a much later castle, but a castle is a really important element of being Norman. In the 1040s and 1050s, the sons of Tancred d'Hauteville go to Italy. Some of them are William Ironarm, Drogo, Humphrey, and the most famous of all is Robert Guiscard, the Cunning. And actually, Tancred d'Hauteville had 12 sons, and they all went to Italy. In Normandy, Tancred d'Hauteville was nothing, but his sons take over Italy and Sicily, and it is Robert Guiscard who eventually becomes the Count of Apulia and Calabria, which is virtually all of southern Italy and Sicily, of southern Italy, and then he helps his brother, his half-brother, conquer Sicily in 1091. The Normans in Italy and Sicily were brigands and mercenaries who married the daughters of local strong men. William the Bastard, in fact, used exile for outlaws, not only William the Bastard, but also Richard II and Robert the Magnificent. This is Viking. It's a Viking law, that you exile traitors or you exile criminals. And the Normans did that too. It's a Viking custom. And so that's one reason all these feisty Normans went to Italy, because they had been outlawed and they were not allowed to stay in Normandy. So great numbers of Normans left Normandy. A large contingent also went to Spain, which was the beginning of the Reconquista of Spain. One interesting quote I have here from Graham Loud, who has written the history of Robert Guiscard, is that the slow and gradual occupation of Italy turned the process of Norman infiltration of Italy into a mirror image of the Viking occupation of Normandy. And so he is comparing the way the Vikings settled Normandy and conquered it bit by bit to the way the Normans conquered Sicily in the exact same way. It was the settlement of Italy was characterized by assimilation, adaptation, and infiltration over a number of decades. Well, we're running out of time, and I'm going to be very brief about the foundation of the Norman Church, but I'll try to tell you who the key characters are. And the main piece of evidence here is the life of Erlewong, who I mentioned before. Recall that William of Dijon came in 1002 with Cluniac reform, but the abbeys he reformed, Fécamp and Jumièges, didn't become Cluniac, and in fact William of Dijon was only there for 6 months, but he did leave his nephew at Jumièges. In 1034 to 1037, however, there was a foundation of the Abbey of Beck, and the Abbey of Beck was a native foundation, and it was a Norman foundation. The author of The Life of Erlewine considered all the existing Norman abbeys corrupt. Erlewine comes to found the abbey step by step in a process almost of assimilation. He started out as a knight, and he started out at the epitome of knightly prowess. He was the best, most famous, most brave, most brilliant knight in all of Normandy, and all the Normans wanted him, and the Duke wanted him at his court. And just at the very peak of his fame and prosperity, he then raised the question, is this all there is to life? I've made it to the top, what's next? And he begins to contemplate, and he begins to think there must be more to life than this. And eventually, he comes to the realization through his own contemplation that he wants to become a Christian, and he wants to convert to Christianity, and he wants to found a monastery. It's an extraordinary story. He comes to the conclusion all by himself. He goes out and he tries to research the abbeys of Normandy. He goes and looks at all of them, and he visits all the churches. And the stories in the Vita Erlewine, the Life of Erlewine, tell how corrupt the Norman monasteries are. He says they all live like the old Danes. They slug each other and fight each other, and they laugh and joke in church, and one of them knocks the teeth down the throat of his companion in standing in line to go into Mass, and they are just completely corrupt. And so clearly Erlewine is going to found a real monastery that's not corrupt like all the others. So all the Normans are still like all the old Danes. So step by step, through a process of his own contemplation, he teaches himself to read and write, and he teaches himself to sing the Psalms, and he finds some kind of a rule, but we're never told what kind of a rule. It's a really strict one that he imposes on the monks. And one really interesting thing is his mother joins him as co-founder of Beck, and she is his partner in the foundation of the Abbey of Beck. She's the one who bakes the bread and washes the clothes and takes care of the monks and does the housewifely thing while the monks are out growing the crops and singing the psalms and all the things that they're doing and learning how to read and write. And what happens is that poor Erlewine, he builds a monastery, and he builds it in the wrong place, and there's no water, and the monks are starving, and they're having a terrible time. And it's at this point that Lanfranc arrives like an angel from heaven. Lanfranc arrives in about the 1040s, and he was a lawyer from Pavia in northern Italy, a very renowned and famous scholar who had come to Normandy to teach at Avranches. Now, one might wonder why in the world he would want to teach at Avranches, because it's out in the middle of absolutely nowhere. Let me find Avranches here. Okay, it is in the far west of Normandy. Here's Avranches. The city of Avranches is right here in the far west of Normandy, and it's the wild, wild west. There's virtually nothing there. The land's depopulated. There are no churches. There are no nobles. There's nobody there, so why is he going to teach there? Who knows? Anyway, he doesn't teach. He may or may not have taught, but he's captured by robbers. He's tied to a tree in the forest, and he makes a vow to God that if God will just save him and set him free so he doesn't starve to death tied to the tree in the forest, that he will then go. He's not a monk. He's a secular scholar. He then will go and join the poorest, most miserable abbey in all of Normandy, and that was Beck. And so he shows up on Erlewine's doorstep, and Erlewine thinks God has really bestowed a miracle on him. Lanfranc seems like a gift from heaven. And here, the Vita Erlewine shifts gears, because they had been talking about how successful Erlewine was in finding enlightenment and reaching knowledge through all of this self-knowledge. And then, when Lanfranc gets there, it's now viewed as a great failure. For one thing, Erewhon had a really strict rule that he was imposing on the monks, and it was so strict that the monks were running away, and he couldn't convert anyone. He only had 2 monks in the whole monastery. But when Lanfranc came, he seems to have brought the Benedictine rule, but most important of all, he opened a school, and that is the source of Beck's success, because Lanfranc was a very famous teacher and scholar and lawyer, and so people came running from all over Northern Europe, from Italy and Germany and France and England, and everybody came to study in Lanfranc's school, not only churchmen, but also laymen, the sons of duques or military leaders. And so who might those sons of the nobles have been? My theory, and it's kind of controversial, but my theory is that whatever families gave grants of land to Beck during this time of Lanfranc's school, probably their sons went to the school of Beck. And so it's conjecture, but I don't see any other way you can figure out who these lay scholars were who studied. And lo and behold, all these men who might have studied at Beck, if my theory is right, they end up being the chief men in the government of William the Conqueror, William the Bastard, when he becomes Duke. So all these students came to study with Lanfranc. In 1036, William's uncle, Archbishop of Rouen, died, and he was succeeded by Moguer, another of William's uncles. And Moguer also protected William the Bastard. In 1041 to 1042, there was an unsuccessful attempt to introduce the Truce of God into Normandy, because the Normans just weren't Christian enough for it yet. They couldn't understand the concept of having a peace of God or a truce of God. But then that was just at the time that Lanfranc arrived, and in 1044 Lanfranc became prior of Beck, and now all these reformers in Normandy, like the ones at Fécamp and Jumièges, are getting together and they hold an ecclesiastical council at Rouen. But in 1046, late 1046, the Western Vicomtes and Guy of Burgundy in Normandy revolt and try to put Guy of Burgundy in as Duke of Normandy, but Henry I of France intervened on William's behalf and saved William's duchy for him. And it was in 1047, in January, at the Battle of Valais-Dune, that William, at the age of about 15 or 16, actually won control of Normandy. Immediately after that, a large ecclesiastical council was held near Caen, and William was present, and he took the side of the church by the proclamation of the Truce of God in Normandy. So on certain holidays, there could be no fighting and no warfare on Christian holidays and on Sundays. But in 1047, Leo IX became Pope, and he was the first of the reforming popes, the moderate reform popes. And this is when the investiture idea comes in, the conflict between church and state. In 1048 is the opening of the Council of Reims, and in 1050, William recaptured Brionne and re-entered Rouen. Now he had unified the duchy. It was at this point that he married Matilda of Flanders, and he made this really important marriage alliance with the daughter of Baldwin IV, Count of Flanders. And this was so important to William's ambitions. This is 1051, the very year that William was promised that he would be King of England, that he would inherit it. And so he married the Count of Flanders. We want to look at this other map to see where Flanders is. Flanders is right up here, kind of off the map, off to the right, but it's also across the channel from England, and so it's a perfect place to have an ally if you want to invade England. Here is Flanders, right over here. And so excuse me, I'm in the wrong place. Flanders is right over here. Here. This area right here, and so we can see that it's a perfect place, it's a perfect ally to have to invade England, and also it gives him ambitions to expand in this direction into Flanders. So William the Conqueror then is looking at expansion. So he marries Matilda of Flanders, and immediately at the court of Rome, William was denounced and excommunicated at the Council of Reims in Normandy, and at the papal court in Rome, Normandy was put under interdict. And in that very year, Lanfranc spent the entire year with the Pope. He traveled around with him in 1051 with Pope Leo. When Lanfranc returned, something really funny happened. It's really weird. William the Conqueror at first tried to send Lanfranc into exile. And Lanfranc then got on this old lame horse and started limping along the road and ran into William the Conqueror on the road. And he said to William, "Look, if you really want to get rid of me, give me a better horse." And William the Conqueror thought that was the funniest joke he had ever heard. And I don't see what's funny about it, but anyway, because of that clever joke that Lanfranc told, William the Conqueror adopted Lanfranc as his chief advisor and virtually put him in over the head of the English church, of the Norman church. Okay, so something fishy about that story was going on. But that's the story, that's the way it goes. He makes a joke about a horse, and now Lanfranc appears to take over the oversight of the Norman church. He was put on a watchtower over the church, and in 1054, at the ecclesiastical council at Lisieux, with Duke William present and Lanfranc present, they deposed William's uncle Mauger as Archbishop of Rouen, and made him step down, and they put in his place Maurilius, who was at that time a monk of Fécamp, but previously had been a monk in northern Italy in a reform abbey. So what Lanfranc seems to be doing is bringing in reformers to help him reform Normandy and help to Christianize these Danes, who are still half pagan, as the Life of Erlewine says. And by the way, the Life of Erlewine was written by Gilbert Crispin, who was one of Lanfranc's students, and so it has Lanfranc's view. Well, in the 1050s, Anselm, yet another Italian, arrived at Bec from Aosta on the edge of Italy and France. Anselm became Lanfranc's star pupil, and shortly after that, at the Synod of Melfi, and this is after the Normans defeated one of the popes in a great military battle, the popes capitulated and accepted those Normans in Italy and made them their vassals. The Normans in Italy became the vassals of Pope Nicholas II, and Pope Nicholas actually granted Robert Guiscard Sicily and Apulia, and he actually already held Apulia, but nobody held Sicily except the Muslims at that time. So what Pope Nicholas was doing was was acquiring a feudal army by adopting the Normans in Italy as his own army. Meanwhile, in 1060, Lanfranc became the abbot of Saint Etienne at Caen, which was the ducal abbey, which in fact William the Conqueror had to found in order to get the Pope to approve his marriage to Matilda of Flanders. And so in order to atone for the sin of his marriage, but remain married in this important marriage alliance, William and his wife Matilda agreed to build 2 twin monasteries in the city of Caen, and Lanfranc became the abbot of Saint Etienne at Caen, the most important abbey after Bec at that time in Normandy. And here is Duke William again, who is at this point sitting on a throne and ordering ships to be built to go to England and conquer. Here is Lillebonne, where all the nobles swore an oath to him to support him. It's a church similar to the ones the synods would have been held in, the councils, church councils. And here is the Saint Etienne of Caen, which was the abbey that Lanfranc became the abbot of in Caen. And here is La Trinité, which is the twin abbey for women, which William the Conqueror's daughter became the abbess of. And so he became the supporter of the church. Well, Anselm then became prior of Bec, and Lanfranc began to develop the city of Caen. He built canals, he built market towns, he developed trade, he built enterprise, he encouraged manufacture of leather and shoes and goods and cloth. He expelled the abbot of he took over the church. He expelled the abbot of Saint-Evroul, Robert, and replaced him with a monk of Bec. And so he did that systematically throughout Normandy until by the end of the Norman period, virtually every abbey in Normandy was ruled by a monk of Bec. And then when Lanfranc went to England as Archbishop of Canterbury, he started importing Bec monks to come in and be the abbots of England as well, of the abbeys of England. Well, when Robert was expelled as abbot of Saint-Evroul, he went to Italy to see the new pope, Pope Alexander. But Pope Alexander, since he was a student of Lanfranc's, wouldn't go against Lanfranc. Instead, he gave to Robert the abbey of St. Euphemia in Italy, and then Robert brought his two sisters who had taken vows as nuns at Saint-Evroul to Italy. They abandoned the veil and they joined him, and they married well. Even though they had been nuns in Normandy, they just kept that a secret. And in fact, Judith, one of the sisters, married Robert Guiscard. In 1061, Alexander became pope. He was a former student of Lanfranc's at Bec, and Alexander later granted William the Bastard the papal banner to conquer England. Well, in all of this story, the finale is the conquest of England, of course, by William the Conqueror and these Normans as they go into the Battle of Hastings. It looks to me like the Normans are very Viking. They retain a lot of their Viking qualities, and they adapt very well to their new environment, which is kind of a Viking thing, and create something new, as they had in Russia and in England. Next time we'll see how England and Normandy join together and build a new culture out of the two of them together. Okay?